can pick a bale a day.
Well, me and my gal can pick a bale of cotton.
I mean, my gal can pick a bale a day.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to start in 1939. The plight of the sharecropper wasn't new. In order to understand the situation, we're going to back up for just a few minutes to the Civil War. Post-Civil War Reconstruction played a part in the birth of sharecropping. A huge problem for the South was how to reintegrate 4 million freed slaves into Southern life and work. Instead of slavery, the labor arrangement became known as sharecropping. Basically, the slaves freed by law had nowhere to go, and the plantation owners had no farm help. Hence the creation of sharecropping. Up to the Civil War, cotton laborers were predominantly Black slaves. After emancipation, poor whites competed with Blacks for this new kind of slavery. And I'm certain you've heard people talk about sharecropping being just another name for slavery, and it pretty much was. Sharecropping was never a winning situation for the freed slaves or for the poor whites. In this slide you're looking at, you can see the cycle of poverty for the sharecropper. We'll talk about it for just a minute. The sharecropper is given land and seed and promises owner half of the crop. The sharecropper pays rent and buys food and clothes on credit from the landowner. The sharecropper gives owner half of the crop and sells the other half. Money from crop sales is not enough to pay debts from the whole year, so the sharecropper must work another year to pay the debt by giving the owner a greater share of next year's crop. There's no way to get ahead. And let's talk about a couple of things on this slide. At the top, it says the sharecropper is given land and seed. The sharecropper is not given anything. They're basically allowed to plant the seed on the land. The seed is then charged to the sharecropper's account. The sharecropper lives in a shack, but rent for that shack is charged to his account. He buys his food and clothing on credit from the landowner. And usually the money from the crop sales is not enough to pay the debts from the whole year. This is because, and I'm not lumping all the landowners into one category here, because there were some honest landowners. However, the landowners kept the books. They also charged interest, and the interest was 10% or more. It was up to the landowner what they wanted to charge. And that's just the way it was. The housing for the sharecropper, part of the problem was the sharecropper a lot of the time wasn't even allowed to grow a garden for vegetables, because every inch of that land was planted in cotton right up to the walls of the sharecropper shack. And not only was the sharecropper at the mercy of the landowner, but also at the mercy of Mother Nature. The crop was never a sure thing. So I think by now you have a clear picture of the situation. Let's move on into the 20th century in the Bootheel of Missouri. In part one, we talked about the Bootheel swamp and how lumbering removed the trees. And then in 1905, the Little River drainage ditch drained over 500,000 acres for farming. The drainage was not free. The landowners were taxed per acre in 1905 up to $3 an acre for this drainage system. And this was a lot of money. Some landowners couldn't pay the taxes, so they would lose their land through foreclosure. So So gradually, big business started owning a large percentage of the land in the Bootheel, and it was a sad situation. And it even, it got worse during the Depression, which began in 1929. As we all know, so many people lost everything they had. By 1910, 77% of the farms in Pemiscot County were operated by tenants or sharecroppers. The tenants and the sharecroppers, they're basically the same, just a little different. The tenant provided more of the equipment, possibly, so therefore he got more of the share of the crop. So tenant farming and sharecropping, two different things, but very, very similar. Essentially, the sharecroppers, by the time of the 20s and 30s, for the most part, worked for big business, insurance companies, banks. They owned, by 1935, they owned at least 200,000 acres in the Bootheel. The Bootheel was considered the richest cotton country of the Deep South. In the counties of Pemiscot, New Madrid, and Mississippi, the acreage planted in cotton in 1939 was 230,000 acres. In 1936, it was described as, if you can imagine this, a wide belt extending 300 miles north and south and stretching 1,600 miles from the Carolinas to western Texas. And it was devoted almost exclusively to the commercial crop of cotton. Production this size requires massive manpower. By 1936, approximately 5.5 million poor whites and 3 million poor blacks were enslaved by sharecropping in the South. Now that's the South as a whole, not just Missouri. And I hope this has kind of given you a picture of the enormity of King Cotton. Now let's move up to 1933 and that New Deal I've been hinting about. When the Depression hit in 1929, crop prices fell. More landowners lost their farms and more big corporations and banks snatched up the land to benefit from the cash crop, cotton. Sharecroppers went from destitute to desperate. In May 1933, Roosevelt's Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed in an effort to balance the amount of crop production with the demand. They wanted to reduce production, which would force the price of cotton up. The way they did this caused the unintended consequences of the New Deal. The federal government began to pay the landowners not to farm. They would agree to leave a portion of their land idle by as much as 40%. And they would in turn get subsidies from the federal government for not growing cotton. They got paid not to farm. The federal government offered loan programs to implement mechanized farming techniques as well. They figured out one tractor could till as much land as 5 tenant farmers or sharecroppers. In 1935, the AAA assured the sharecroppers that they would be protected, stating that landowners participating in the program were not allowed to reduce labor numbers. Now think about this. Realistically, it doesn't make any sense. How can you reduce production and keep the same number of workers? In signing on to a farm program that aimed to bring supply and demand into greater balance by restricting production, Roosevelt sacrificed long-term improvements for short-term gains. As with many government programs, there's usually a loophole. The AAA was no exception. Before we get to the loophole, I want to talk for a few minutes about the living conditions of the sharecroppers. In 1938, the FSA, which is the Farm Security Administration, sent some representatives to the Bootheel to do an in-depth study of the area. I'm going to give you a lot of information here, but I think it'll really bring home and make apparent the situation. They studied 7 counties in southeast Missouri: Scott, Stoddard, Butler, Dunklin, New Madrid, Mississippi, and Penobscot. There were 6,000 landowners in the Bootheel. However, there were approximately 27,000 tenant farmers and sharecroppers. They were living in crude shacks in the middle of the cotton fields. And if you'll look at this first image, as we say in the South, they weren't living in high cotton. Basically, this shack, it looks like it doesn't even have a window there on the left. I heard stories, read stories during my research where the sharecroppers didn't even have the money to buy nails if repairs were needed on the shacks. They truly weren't fit for human habitation. 98% of them had no indoor toilet facilities. 97% of these shacks had a well drilled near an outhouse. And this situation led to rampant disease. The malaria rate in the Bootheel was 20 times the rate of the entire state of Missouri, with 2/3 the death rate of the state occurring in southeast Missouri. Typhoid was 9 times the state rate. Tuberculosis, 2 times the state rate. Infant mortality was 20 times the state rate. These rates weren't helped by the fact that doctor visits had to be approved by the landowner, because the landowner had to pay the doctor, and then it would be deducted at harvest from the sharecropper's account as well. And often the sharecroppers just waited too late to contact the doctor. Now, the average growing season was 188 days, and it was absolutely not uncommon, not strange at all, for children, once they reached the age of 6, to be put to work in the fields. The more cotton they could pick, the more money they could make. So every family member pitched in. There was an 8.5% illiteracy rate compared to 2.9% in the whole state. Keep in mind, in the 1930s, the schools in southern Missouri were still segregated. So these sharecroppers and tenant farmers living out in the middle of the field, there may not have been a school in the area for the kids. If there was a school, they probably didn't have transportation to get there. They didn't have school buses coming to pick them up like we do now. There was also a high rate of malnutrition. For the most part, the sharecroppers' diet consisted of corn grit, beans, and greens only in season. Remember, they couldn't, for the most part, grow vegetable gardens. And I hope you've got a clear picture of their life during normal times. Now let's talk about the loophole. As with most government programs, they're going to find it. So remember, in 1933, the landowners that participated in the AAA program weren't allowed to reduce the number of the sharecroppers. Well, it didn't take them long to figure out that all they needed to do was change their job description. So they started changing them from sharecroppers to day laborers. Now remember, the day laborers, they only needed them about 120 days a year. That's for planting and harvesting. So with the sharecropper, average income before they paid their debt was $415 a year. If they switched them to day laborers, they'd pay them 75 cents to $1 a day. And that would reduce their salary or pay to $251 a year. This was a devastating blow to the already miserable existence of the sharecropping families. And again, I'll repeat, this is not to say that all the landowners exploited the system in this way. There were fair and honest landowners involved, but the majority, and especially those big business landowners, their main focus was cash return on their investment as fast as they could flip it. The people were just collateral damage. In 1936, the Supreme Court ruled the AAA unconstitutional. This did nothing but make the landowners move faster to change the sharecroppers to day laborers. Their monetary gains enabled them to invest in farm mechanization instead of wages. To add insult to injury, 1937 was even more devastating to not only the sharecroppers, but the whole of the Bootheel and the farming way of life. Remember that network of drainage ditches we talked about in part 1. In 1928, Congress authorized the levee at Bird's Point in the New Madrid floodway to be used as an emergency relief valve for the Mississippi River during times of flooding. Essentially, the Army Corps of Engineers blow the levee with dynamite to save the area of Cairo, Illinois. Where do you think all the water goes when they blow the levee? Bootheel of Missouri. In 1937, the year of the Great Ohio and Mississippi River Valley flood, the Army Corps of Engineers gave the sharecroppers 3 days to gather their belongings, find a place to go with no transportation before the levee would be blown. I want to give you an idea of the amount of water behind that levee. 130,000 acres in the Bootheel went underwater. The flood was 22 miles wide. This was in the winter, January 25th, 1937. Homeless, cold, and hungry, approximately 12,000 refugees would spend weeks in shelters, boxcars, and on the floors of abandoned buildings. Before the flood, they had nothing. Now they had less. At the end of it all, 4,000 acres in the Bootheel was rendered useless by sand dunes and erosion. What the sharecroppers couldn't carry was washed away in the freezing floodwaters along with the shacks they called home. Federal relief amounted to approximately $18 a month per family, but it was a long time coming. I just want to make a note here that as of 2011, the practice of blowing the levee at Cairo, Illinois, was still utilized by the Corps of Engineers. I don't know if anybody remembers that flood in 2011. All right, we have a new image up here, and believe it or not, there was one good thing that happened for the sharecroppers in 1937. The Farm Security Administration implemented a program called the Southeast Missouri Farms Project. This would be one of the first prefabricated housing communities constructed. It was considered an experimental community on a tract of farmland north of New Madrid. The planning began in 1937, but construction didn't start until 1938. The goal was to give sharecroppers a chance to become self-sufficient farmers. The homes weren't fancy, but rather nice if you look at the picture. But it was a start. When the project was finished, this is amazing to me, they had constructed 100 homes in 212 days. The homesteaders could rent individual plots on government-owned land. Unfortunately, 100 homes couldn't house so many displaced and destitute sharecroppers. One resident of the LaForge community was a man by the name of Reverend Owen Whitfield, a sharecropper and local pastor. He was no stranger to the struggle to survive. And just for example, one year he was paid by the landowner the sum of one used man's suit for an entire season of backbreaking work. In that case, it probably wasn't the landowner's fault. He had probably lost everything as well during the Depression. But how was a used man's suit going to feed his wife and children? Although lucky to be in a LaForge home, he didn't forget about the thousands of workers still homeless after the flood. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union had been active in the area since 1936. Membership was growing in the Bootheel, and at that time they had about 4,500 members. Owen Whitfield served as vice president in the organization, and he was determined to do something to help. He had a close relationship with a prominent farmer, and there's much written about this farmer, and he was just a fascinating individual. His name was Thad Snow, a prominent farmer in the Bootheel, and to the dismay of many, Thad Snow became a public ally of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. He actually invited them to unionize the sharecroppers on his 1,000 acres of farmland. Toward the end of 1938, the sharecroppers were advised by the landowners that they would be evicted from the land in January 1939. After the insult of the New Deal, the floods, and the general exploitation of them for decades, they'd had enough. Under the leadership of Owen Whitfield and the encouragement of Thad Snow, among many others, they decided to strike. It was a strike in name only, as they had already lost their jobs, housing, and a pittance of an income. It was intended to be a peaceful demonstration for change. In Owen Whitfield's words, "If we're going to starve, let's starve where people can see us." Now we're gonna show you several images here and just pause for a moment at each one while I describe them. Throughout the night on January 9th, 1939, the sharecroppers moved with their meager belongings to the intersection of highways 60 and 61 in the Bootheel. When the sun came up on January 10th, more than 1,500 sharecroppers and their families were on the roadside from Sikeston, Missouri to Arkansas. And for those of you that don't know where Sikeston is, it's near Cape Girardeau off Highway 55. They set up camps as best they could using furniture and bedding in an attempt to block the icy wind of January. Wood stoves and fires were surrounded by families trying to stay warm. It was a shocking display on two of the most traveled highways of Southeast Missouri. The ultimate goal was to demonstrate the plight of the sharecroppers. It was successful to a degree. Government officials were in a panic. According to then Governor of Missouri, Lloyd Stark, the demonstrators were giving Missouri a bad name. The wheels were turning with what to do. All the sharecroppers wanted was fair treatment and more opportunities for them, like the LaForge Project. Nationwide, the newspapers were exploding with the story. People were paying attention all the way to the White House. Those opposed to helping the sharecroppers, of course, blamed Owen Whitfield and Thad Snow. Both men received death threats. The Red Cross refused to help the sharecroppers because it was a man-made disaster. Thad Snow was frowned upon by his fellow landowners. The sharecroppers expressed no desire for relief. They stated, "We want to work and make our own living." 90% of them wanted to continue farming. That was quite a display. Now we have then Governor of Missouri, Lloyd Stark, in a panic. if you'll go back to, let's see, slide 33 for a moment. Yeah, let's just leave it there for just a minute. So Lloyd Stark is in a panic. The sharecroppers were making Missouri and him look bad. The governor's goal was to get the sharecroppers out of sight. Their visibility was causing a major upheaval all the way to Washington. President Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor wanted something done for the sharecroppers. Basic human needs: food, shelter, clothing, a way to make a living. Well, what was Governor Stark's solution? He sent state health officials to the sites of the demonstrators' camps. State health officials declared the camps a menace to public health. The reasoning was because they lacked clean water and sanitary toilets. Now, take just a moment and wonder why this situation wasn't noticed since the end of the Civil War. The sharecroppers had never had clean water and sanitary toilets. That's amazing to me. But there was a reason. Once the governor received these declarations of a menace to public health, he could order the state police to demolish the camps, load the sharecroppers in trucks, and dump them out of sight. The demonstrators were moved to the middle of nowhere in several areas. Empty buildings were utilized first. Abandoned churches provided pews for beds, for example. Anywhere out of sight was acceptable. Let's go to 34 and then 35. These two images, you can see this is when the state police came in and started demolishing the camps and loading the sharecroppers and their belongings. If you'll move on to 35, there's the state police there, and they're just loading them in trucks and hauling them away. But the governor didn't care where they moved them to. Let's go back. Yes, leave it right there for just a minute. The governor didn't care where they moved the sharecroppers to, as long as they couldn't be seen. A large portion of the demonstrators were moved to, of all places, behind the levee at Bird's Point. Yes, the one they had blown in 1937 to save Cairo. This spillway near the levee in New Madrid County became known as Homeless Junction. This story gets even better. None of the sites provided any better health guards, but they were out of public view, and that was the governor's goal. The sheriff of New Madrid County placed guards at Homeless Junction 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not just to keep the sharecroppers in, but to keep the news media out. President and Mrs. Roosevelt were horrified at the treatment and removal of the sharecroppers. The president ordered food, tents, and necessities be delivered immediately to Homeless Junction. He also ordered emergency cash grants and applications for relocation loans be delivered by the Farm Security Administration without delay. Here's where it gets better. When local officials heard of President Roosevelt's plans, they immediately destroyed Homeless Junction in an effort to prevent any FSA aid reaching the sharecroppers. They scattered people throughout 4 counties. Some were even dumped on back roads to fend for themselves. All for appearances. Now, the federal government wasn't alone in their efforts to, excuse me, to help the sharecroppers. There were people right here in St. Louis and throughout the state determined to help. When Owen Whitfield received death threats, he relocated for a short time to Kirkwood. He resided in Meacham Park. While he was here, he and a prominent St. Louis social activist named Fanny Cook formed a foundation to raise funds to aid the sharecroppers. Along with a multitude of people, the students at Lincoln University in Jefferson City contributed funds, and they purchased 92 acres near Poplar Bluff, Missouri, along the Little Black River. And if you'll go on to slide 36, this would enable the sharecroppers to form their own cooperative community. The community became known as Cropperville. On June 17th, 1939, the first families moved in. They built their own houses, a warehouse, a sorghum mill. Quakers helped them build a church and a school. And Owen Whitfield returned from Kirkwood and moved to Cropperville so he could help establish the community. He and his family also lived there. Determined demonstrators continued to agitate for change for the remainder of 1939, but they did so out of public view. Needless to say, let's back up to part one. With all the chaos and uproar going on, Adrian Posey and Otis Fowler didn't go to trial in March 1939. The trial was continued again to July 1939. July came around. We're still dealing with all the sharecroppers, all these homeless people. So it was continued to November 1939. This entire time, Posey and Fowler, were out. They remained free out on bond. Now, finally, you're going to get some information about this trial. In November 1939, Adrian Posey and Otis Fowler went to trial. Justice still wouldn't be served. 40 witnesses were subpoenaed, but only a third of those would testify. The trial lasted 1.5 days and ended with a hung jury. The judge ordered a mistrial. Then in December 1939, they were granted a change of venue to Butler County, which is Poplar Bluff. The retrial was set for December 18th, 1939. It didn't happen. The retrial was reset for March of 1940. All this time, Posey and Fowler were still out on bond. Finally, on March 28th, 1940, Posey and Fowler were tried again. They were convicted, but not of first-degree murder. They were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years each in the state penitentiary in Jefferson City. They were given 10 days to file an appeal, and of course they took advantage of this. An appeal was filed with the Missouri Supreme Court. They remained out on bond, awaiting the Supreme Court decision. June 10th, 1941, finally, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled that the conviction would stand. Posey and Fowler are finally taken into custody. Now, the crime at Harry Bailey's happened in September 1938. This is June 1941. Finally, they're taken into custody and ordered to serve 15 years. 15 years for the brutal slaying of an innocent woman and the attempted murder of an innocent man who tried to save her. For those of you that might be interested, the Supreme Court transcript is available at this website you're seeing on your screen. If you can't write fast enough and you're interested, if you send me an email, I can send you a link. Well, let's move on and talk about what happened to the sharecroppers. My hope is that by this time, you're wondering what in the world happened to all these people. By 1941, Cropperville was still populated. Many shacks had been built, but many people were still living in tents. Unfortunately, raw sewage polluted the water, so malaria outbreaks were still common. By 1949, Cropperville was deserted. At the onset of World War II, many enlisted and left the area never to return. Others were part of the Great Migration North. There's a memorial in the area in remembrance of those involved in the struggle. If you'll go to slide 38. And if you're interested in visiting this memorial, I can, of course, share with you the location. Let's move on to slide 39. In December 1939, the FSA announced a new 5-point plan to address the housing crisis of the sharecroppers. In June 1940, the FSA unveiled plans for Delmo security homes. These homes were part of a program to increase affordable loans. They built 600 homes in 9 settlements, 1 settlement in each Bootheel County. In 1941, these homes were completed. And interestingly and pleasing to me, in 1994, 80% of the Delmo homes were still in possession of the original families. By 1940, 6 million landowners in the US, the entire country, were on the federal subsidy program. That is, getting paid not to farm. By the 1950s, sharecropping was a thing of the past. Farm automation negated the need for manpower. All these people simply went away. The Great Migration I mentioned, that was between 1910 and 1970. 6 million people left the rural South in search of greater opportunity and a better life. So that's what happened to them. Now let's talk about what happened to the people involved in this murder case. The investigative work of Sheriff John Hosler and Trooper Cletus Bidewell is to be commended. In 1938, DNA testing hadn't even been dreamed about, and the case could have easily been solved for the crime. Trooper Cletus Bidewell continued his law enforcement career. He served 33 years with the FBI in St. Louis, and I'm sure they benefited greatly from his professionalism. He passed away in 1994 at the age of 87 in Webster Groves, Missouri. Sheriff John Hosler went on to serve as chief of police in Caruthersville for 18 years. Sadly, in 1966, at the age of 78, he was killed in a head-on collision caused by a drunk driver east of Wardell, Missouri. Harry Bailey. Many, many stories about Harry Bailey. Harry's adventures ended in March of 1945. At the age of 47, he was involved in an altercation at his bar, the Curve Inn, which resulted in his death. During the scuffle, Harry had the other man pinned in a bear hug from behind. The other man somehow got Harry's gun and fired upwards, with the bullet hitting Harry in the neck. Harry was paralyzed instantly, and he passed away 5 days later. Now let's get to these criminals, Fowler and Posey. Otis Fowler, his sentence of 15 years in prison in 1941 was not fulfilled. I found him married by 1947, and he spent the remainder of his life in Pemiscot County. He died peacefully at his home in 1972 in Hayti. Adrian Posey, his sentence of 15 years in 1941 was not fulfilled either. He married. I couldn't find a wedding date for him, but I did find him residing in Memphis in 1945. He passed away in 1972 in Memphis. Gay Vaughn. Gay Vaughn recovered for the most part from his injuries in the attack by Posey and Fowler. He was able to testify in the trial in 1940. He could remember the argument with Posey and Fowler, but he couldn't remember anything after he was struck in the back of his head. In 1938, he was considered a veritable miracle of modern surgery, and I'm quoting word for word. That's fascinating. In 1940 and 1941, respectively, national crime magazines featured the story of the crime at Harry Bailey's. I was lucky enough to acquire actual copies of these magazines from an archivist in Pennsylvania. Although there are some discrepancies, for the most part, the articles are very accurate. Gay continued farming, blacksmithing, and working as a mechanic in Pemiscot County. In 1942, he married Nanny Taylor and started a new life. It's not known if he ever remembered the crime in its entirety. Personally, I think it would have been a blessing if he didn't. Gay and Nanny raised 4 daughters together. Their firstborn was my mother, born in 1943. I have wonderful memories of my childhood with Mama and Daddy Gay. He went to work for the local school district in McCarty, Missouri. This is a picture of him right before he retired from the school district as superintendent of maintenance. I vividly remember what a hard worker he was. I don't remember any obvious residual disabilities from his injuries. He passed away in 1981 from a stroke at the age of 77. I'll speculate here because I did find documentation that victims of head injuries are at a significantly higher risk of stroke than others. As the years pass, the risk diminishes, but I'll always wonder if it had anything to do with his injuries. And as I said before we sign off tonight, if you're interested in further reading, or if you didn't have time to write down links, you can just send me an email and I'll be happy to provide them. I also have a list of sources for my research if you're interested. And now we'll take questions if anybody has any. We've got, yeah, we're right on time. Does anybody have any questions? I'll give you a couple of minutes to type. Are you seeing any? Oh, yes. Do you know what happened to his first wife's children? Yes, I do. There was only one child left at home at the time of Mary's death. She had sisters. Remember, the second youngest had left home in 1933, I believe, because she got married. When Mary died, the older kids came and collected the youngest daughter, and they finished raising her. Now, keep in mind, Gay was in a coma. He didn't know any of this was going on, but yes, the youngest child's still at home. I think she was 15. She did go to be with her family. Any other questions? I thank you for listening, and I again encourage you to, if you want more information, send me an email. I'll be glad to share. I know it was a long story and I kept you in suspense, but I wasn't about to tell you what interested me in this murder case. That was my cliffhanger last week. The sharecropper homes, I don't know of any still in existence. There are more than one memorials in different places in Southeast Missouri. Again, I can share those locations with you. The sharecropper homes, I remember, I'm going to say about 1979, 1980-ish, I remember seeing just a handful of shacks along the outskirts of the cotton fields down there, but I'm certain by now they've all disintegrated. Cropperville is no longer in existence. The Delmo homes, there are still some of those. The LaForge community is marked a historic place now. It's not in very good condition. I don't think they have the funds for the upkeep. Okay, why did they not serve time? Well, that's the technicalities of the justice system. They were out on bond that entire time. I think September 15th was when Adrian Posey bonded out of the jail in Pemiscot County in 1938. Mary was killed on the 11th. He bonded out by the 15th. No, I'm sorry. He was in until December of 38. And the entire time they're waiting for trial, they're running around on bond. Then the sharecropper strike happened. The court systems were overrun with cases and problems trying to relocate all these people. By the time the trial came around, and at the trial, people were pretty much lackadaisical about the whole thing. It's like if something's not in front of you, it's not as important anymore. And I will tell you that a lot of the witnesses at the trial confessed that they had been drinking. They weren't really sure about this or that. So they got the second-degree murder charges, I think, for implication in the murder of Mary. What really hurt the case was that Gay could not remember what happened. They didn't intend for him to live, and it's unfortunate that he couldn't recover his memory to really testify. So they pretty much got off scot-free. I've wondered that attempted manslaughter myself. It was clearly attempted murder, but they only had the testimony of Arch Patterson, who was not a reliable witness. So basically it was circumstantial evidence. Just because they could prove that Posey and Fowler were there, even though Arch had witnessed the contact between everyone, he just wasn't reliable. And the taxi statement, yes, that was key for me. It's the only word Gay was able to say to the ambulance drivers, to Harry Bailey. That was the one word he could get out. And then Posey, being a taxi driver, I mean, why wasn't that taken into consideration? I don't think we'll ever understand how the court systems work completely. It was just, they just considered it circumstantial. And we depend on our juries, and with beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I guess they had that shadow of a doubt. Anybody else? Those are great questions, and I could talk about it all night till my Zoom limit runs out. And again, I welcome your emails if you have questions or comments or anything. I can't say I like to talk about it because it's not a pleasant subject, but I welcome questions. Oh, I enjoyed my research. I don't know that I'll do it again right away, but I enjoyed the research, and hopefully my kids will look forward to that inheritance when I'm gone. So thank you everyone for being with us tonight.